So you want to make a video about rare books. Welcome to a video on videos. In this episode, the first of two, I will walk you through writing your script, the hardware and software you need, staging your shots, and making sure you and the books look your best. If you're looking for Blender editing tips, check out the next episode, which I have linked below. I'm Allie Alvis, who you may know better as Book Historia. I'm a former special collections librarian and current rare book cataloger at antiquarian book dealer Type Punch Matrix, which is where I am now. I started a video series in 2020 called Bite-Sized Book History, a series of short videos on various bibliographic topics. I am completely self-taught when it comes to video making. Any and all of my skills have come from trial and error, YouTube tutorials, or simply banging my head against the wall until something happened. All this is to say, if you can find better techniques out there to do the things I'm talking about, use those. This is just what works for me, and it is not one size fits all. Okay, first things first. What do you want your video to be about? I generally stick to topics that I have at least a passing familiarity with, or that I know somebody that I can have on as a guest to supplement the little that I know about it. Even better if I've already written a talk or an article or a blog post on the topic. This is largely due to the lack of time that I have to devote to doing new research on a video. Bringing in a guest is one way to take the research burden off yourself and also to amplify other voices. But do make sure to ask them before you count on them to be a guest in your video. Writing a script for your video can be very labor intensive, and a lot of popular videos out there use a very set structure. This generally consists of leading into the video with a brief hook before going into your preliminaries like introducing yourself or the opening credits. This catches your audience's attention and entices them to watch the rest of your video. I am guilty of not doing this in my first 3 seasons of Bite-Sized Book History, but I will be moving forward. I also did it in this video, which you may have noticed. I write my scripts in shortish bullet point phrases. This helps me to ensure readability so I can pick out phrases at a glance. There are also teleprompter type attachments that you can get for an iPad or a computer, but I don't have an iPad, so I do things the old-fashioned way. Unless you rehearse a lot, you won't be filming your whole talking head narration all in one take. Organizing your script into bullet points makes sure that you have space to edit out if you fumble a word or otherwise make a mistake. I don't add endnotes or footnotes when I am working through my script. I keep a list of links down at the bottom of the document as I'm working that I can paste into a YouTube description later. This is great for readability, but becomes a little bit of a pain if you want to rework your script into a longer, more scholarly cited article or blog post. I always assume I'm going to ad-lib a little bit when I get the book in front of me. When I'm writing my script, I add the main points that I want to highlight about each book. But, you know, if you have a book in front of you, it's always good to allow yourself a little bit of breathing room to touch on anything you may have forgotten while you're writing your script or something that catches your eye. Now that you've got your script, it is time for filming. These are the pieces of hardware and software that I have in my video making toolbox, but use whatever works best for you. Obviously, the most important piece of hardware is a phone with a camera on it, or a camera. Make sure your camera or phone can film in 4K/HD. This is the video quality that looks best on YouTube. Mounting your camera on a tripod gives your shots stability. Phones and cameras have different tripod attachment requirements. Cameras usually have a threaded hole in the bottom to screw directly onto the tripod, while phones tend to need some sort of gripper attachment. Cameras and phones have built-in microphones, but having an external microphone can give your audio more fidelity. I find lapel mics to be particularly versatile. You can even buy lapel mics with 2 mic attachments, so both you and a guest can be mic'd at the same time. Make sure your mic has the right output shape for your camera or your phone. You may need an adapter depending on what sort of hardware you're working with. Lighting fixtures like ring lights are not a necessity, but are super helpful. I am definitely a ring light convert. They're relatively cheap, and you can mount your camera or phone in the center of them to give really great direct light. I used to just use a living room lamp as my main light source in my videos, and you can really tell the difference when I got my ring light. Soundproofing is also something to consider. When I'm filming at home, I throw a heavy blanket on top of an ironing board and place that in front of me while I'm filming. Soundproofing is particularly important if you're filming in a place that is kind of echoey, like somewhere with hardwood floors. Now on to the intangible part of video making, the software. The main piece of software that I use is Blender. Blender is my main video editing software. Blender was developed as a computer animation software, but has a pretty robust video editing system built in. And it's free! It has a pretty steep learning curve, but there are plenty of great YouTube tutorials out there, which I have linked on part 2 of this 2-episode series on video editing. Mac computers come with a piece of video editing software called iMovie, which I have never used, but I have heard good things about. A secondary piece of software that I use extensively is AffinityPhoto. AffinityPhoto is my main image editing software. I make all of my graphics and subtitles in Affinity, and also resize images to fit the screen. AffinityPhoto is a software that you have to purchase, but it is much cheaper than Photoshop and is not on a subscription. There are plenty of free pieces of image editing software out there, including in-browser Photoshop emulator Photopea. Another simple image editor is Irfanview. I generally only use Irfanview as a place to quickly paste screenshots. It's kind of a one-trick pony for me, but I do use it a lot. It is also free. I no longer use Audacity, but I have in the past. Audacity is a great piece of software if you want to do more complex things with your audio editing. I've generally found that Audacity is not necessary for the kind of videos that I make. Blender has built-in audio editing tools, so I don't need to get too complicated. But if you want to experiment with it, it is also free. So you've got your script and equipment. Now it's time to set up. Always pay attention to the orientation of your camera. Places like YouTube and Vimeo favor a landscape orientation, while TikTok and Instagram and Twitter and Facebook even prefer a portrait orientation. Swapping your video orientation after recording is possible, but it can look a little bit awkward. I would love to experiment with having 2 cameras running side by side, one phone and one camera, one recording in portrait and one recording in landscape. But I am not really sure how effective that would be, so it is kind of still living in the land of ideas. I'll let you know if I ever get around to trying it. Most videos feature a main narrator on screen to guide the viewers through information. Framing up your shot and making sure that you're in focus works best if you have a camera with a rotating display, much like mine. Or if you have a friend who can make sure that you're framed up and can press record for you. But if you don't have either of those things, do the best to frame up your shot before you get into it. Then press record and film some test footage of yourself moving and talking. That way you can go back and fix any awkward positioning before you record a 20-minute video with only the top of your head showing, which has happened to me. Make sure your background isn't too busy with patterns or passers-by. Loud patterns and lots of motion can distract your viewers from what you really want to be talking about. Backgrounds are also useful for communicating the tone of the video. I often try to include bookshelves. Try to think ahead for where graphics might go when you're composing your shot. I tend to place myself in the center, but a TV news anchor style of placing yourself more left or more right might be more useful for you depending on what you want to have on screen. If you have a bigger team, the person who's writing the script and the person who's delivering the script may be 2 different people. But I am a one-man band, so here is how I deal with talking on screen. I don't memorize my whole script and recite it without breaks directly into the camera. I memorize a couple of bullet points and then pause in between so I leave myself room for editing. In my head, I call these little memorized bits chunks. It's much easier to edit around chunks if I flub a line or a cat meows or something like that. That way I don't have to go back and re-record the entire script. Make sure to give yourself editing room around each chunk of talking. When you're done, instead of looking directly back down on your script or off camera or anything else, look directly into the camera for a couple of seconds and smile, like this. I know it kind of looks a little creepy and it feels kind of awkward, but you will thank yourself later when you're doing your editing. Also, try not to split sentences up over chunks. When you're editing sentences back together, your audio can get a little bit disjointed and footage can seem choppy. If you have a long quote or find that you just can't get a whole chunk out smoothly, you can always just read off your script. If I'm really struggling with a chunk, I read off my script like I'm doing now, then I simply edit B-roll over it so you can't tell. Here are some pointers on being on screen with a book. This setup with books facing the camera and also me facing the camera tends to be the most efficient way to set up this kind of shot. Another way is to have books sitting on a table and you standing next to the table. But in this type of shot, you run the risk of accidentally walking directly in front of the camera in order to point something out in a book. Having both you and the books in frame at the same time gives your viewers a much better sense of the scale of the objects. It's also an opportunity to demonstrate handling best practice. While you should be prepared to get at least one comment along the lines of, "Oh goodness gracious, why aren't you wearing white gloves when you're handling these precious objects?" you should be aware of other handling practices you're showing off when you have books on screen. Use all the tools at your disposal that you would have if you were looking at a book as an individual in the reading room. Everything from snake weights to properly hold pages open rather than holding them down yourself, book pillow supports, and even your classic green foam supports. Also, when the book is open, try not to pick it up out of the supports when you're on camera. If you need a detail shot, you can get that in B-roll, which I will talk more about later. This is kind of a do as I say, not as I do situation. When I'm at home filming with my personal collection, I am wont to pick books up and open them while holding them rather than having them in supports like this. Also make sure that your filming area is uncluttered and with no food or drink visible. This is another example of modeling good behaviors. You would never have a bottle of water on the table with a book in your special collections reading room. Okay, you've heard me throw around the term B-roll a few times in this video. What is it? When you're filming something like this, it can be difficult to get close-up shots at the same time as when you're filming these wide shots of you and the books. B-roll is the technical term for these shots that you get later and intersperse with your A-roll, which is basically this. There are a couple of ways to approach B-roll. One is to have a main camera running and another camera going at the same time pointed at the book to get detail shots at the same time as you're talking about it. This is time efficient but can be really awkward. You do end up sort of maneuvering around the second camera when you're filming. The best way to do B-roll on a budget is to film through your entire main narrative, your A-roll, and make either mental or physical notes on your script about where B-roll needs to be cut in. Then immediately after filming, go back and film those close-up shots so you don't have to reset your workspace and you don't forget where you need to film. You can also shoot your B-roll backwards. For example, I had the opportunity to film at the New York Antiquarian Book Fair this year, but I did that before I had actually written my script about the history of antiquarian book fairs. So I let my B-roll kind of dictate the points that I brought up when talking about book fairs. There's another type of B-roll that is just as important as video, and that is still images. With editing tricks, you can pan and zoom on plenty of still images of books to make them seem more dynamic, even though it's not actually technically video. I'll talk through the technicalities of panning and zooming and doing that through the editing process in the second video in this duo. But for now, let's just talk about how to best compose a still shot to be edited into a video. I find taking photos in landscape orientation to be most effective when I'm taking stills to be edited into videos. This gives you more room to sort of move around when you're editing. Here's an example of panning on a photo in landscape orientation. And here's an example of a photo in portrait orientation. You can see how we get to the edges of the image pretty quickly when we pan across it. Digitized images of books from other collections and screenshots can also be used in this way. When you get down to it, pretty much any video or still image of a book can become B-roll. In the early days of lockdown in 2020, when I first started filming my videos, my B-roll was really my steering mechanism. I had a lot of pictures of books and not a lot of access to physical books. So I let my pictures that I had taken over the years dictate the topics that I was talking about. With both video and stills, try to make sure that your footage is dynamic. The point of having a video is for people to experience the book in a way that is not just flat top-down digitization. Turn pages, experiment with different angles in your stills. The point of video is to communicate the fact that the book is a usable, movable machine. So how do you bring a second person into this equation? There are many ways to introduce a guest to a video. Obviously, the most familiar way is to have them physically be here with you. Depending on what format the guest portion will take, i.e. interview or quick cameo or conversation, there are different ways to compose your shot. The most complex way is to have two different cameras running simultaneously, with one pointed at you and one pointed at your guest. This is the Oprah method. I have only done this once, and I learned a lot about filming from the mistakes I made. Top tip, make sure that when you're filming with two different cameras, they're recording at the same frame rate. If they're not recording at the same frame rate and you try to go in post-production and adjust that, the audio no longer matches up with lip movements. It can be fixed, but it takes a lot of effort. Having you and your guest on one side of the table, Last Supper style, is the best way to sort of communicate a conversation going on. You can also simply point your camera at your guest and talk to them from off-screen. This can produce kind of a disjointed, impersonal feel though, and really works better if you're using the footage of your guest as B-roll. Of course, now there are tools like FaceTime and Zoom to let you talk to your guests remotely. It can be easy for recordings of Zoom conversations to feel kind of boring or static. So make sure to switch up your shots and use plenty of B-roll. It may seem like an unnecessary formality, but it's a good idea to have a release form drawn up for your guests to sign. This will give them a better sense of how their likeness will be used in the future and give them an opportunity to ask for certain things. For example, I had a guest who preemptively requested that YouTube comments be turned off when her video would be posted. So that is a wrap on the first of 2 videos on how to make a video about rare books. You can find the video all about the editing process here. As always, likes, comments, and subscribes are very appreciated. And if you use this video to make videos of your own, I would love to hear about it. Let me know. I will see you in part 2 for a whirlwind ride through Blender editing.